All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started in the interest of time. I know folks are still joining us. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jessica Bennett. I am Director of STEM Education at APLU, and I serve as co-lead of the Aspire Alliance Institutional Change Initiative. We are so glad you're able to join us today for this webinar sponsored by the NSF Includes Aspire Alliance for an Inclusive and Diverse STEM Faculty. This case study webinar features leaders from Aspire IChange Cohort 1 member institution, Indiana University-Purdue University, Indianapolis, IUPUI. I'll be the one who has to say it all, and now no one else will. And they're going to share their ongoing learning and progress in implementing a new tenure pathway for faculty who contribute significantly to creating a diverse, inclusive, and welcoming campus environment. We're so excited to be able to spotlight their work today. Our plan for today's webinar will include introductions of our moderator, presenters, and panelists, a presentation by the team from IUPUI about their new policy, questions prepared by the moderator to further dive into IUPUI's processes, mindsets, challenges, excitement, and then we're going to have an opportunity for you all to share questions with them for the panelists to answer. We ask that you place any questions that you have throughout the presentation and panel into the Q&A feature so that we can pass them along at the appropriate time. And as you all may know, Zoom webinar has a great upvote feature. So if there are questions you really like that someone else has put into the Q&A feature, please upvote them so we can make sure to address those. I'd now like to introduce our moderator, my colleague, friend, and mentor, Dr. Kimberly Griffin. Dr. Griffin is Professor and Associate Dean of Graduate Studies and Faculty Affairs for the College of Education at the University of Maryland, College Park. Her research is primarily focused in three areas: diversity and equity in graduate education and the professoriate, diversity within the Black higher education community, and mentoring and career development. Kimberly co-leads the research team for the NSF Includes Aspire Alliance, coordinating the execution of the research design, instrument development, data collection, facilitating communication across our multiple research studies, and also managing our strategy for dissemination of findings. We're so glad to have her here, and I'm going to turn the wheel over to her. Thanks, Kimberly.
Thank you so much, Jess. It's such a lovely introduction, and it's really, really wonderful to be with all of you today. Good afternoon. I am so thrilled to be moderating this session and to have the opportunity to be in conversation with our colleagues at IUPUI about their outstanding and innovative work to address inequities in the tenure and promotion process. So as I reflected on moderating this panel today, I wanted just to start our conversation with a little bit of context and a few comments about this moment that we're currently in. And I'm sure that many of you join us today with the questions and conversations about scholars of color generally and Black women in particular, and their navigation of the tenure and promotion process maybe floating around in the back of your mind, or maybe floating around in the front of your mind as you sit down and join us today. There have been several very, very public cases of Black scholars being denied tenure in the last couple of years. So you may remember the case of Dr. Paul Harris at the University of Virginia last summer, or more recently, Dr. Cornel West. And of course, there's the case of Nicole Hannah-Jones at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. These cases have all raised really important questions about who gets to make decisions about tenure and promotion, what factors are and are not being considered, and the lack of clarity about the criteria on which these decisions are based. And while I'm not happy about the circumstances that have brought increased attention to these issues, in some ways, I think it's really important that we see, that we have these conversations, that we see students, faculty, media outlets, institutional leaders, and other stakeholders asking questions like, why don't we have more tenured faculty of color? Why aren't faculty more diverse? And what should we be doing about it, perhaps most importantly? So while I think it's critical to take up these issues, in many ways, these very public cases don't highlight some of the most common and pervasive challenges that our colleagues of color face in the tenure and promotion process. These recent cases are eye-catching, they're troublesome, they're disturbing, but I wouldn't say that they're reflective of the challenges that most faculty of color are facing on their campuses, or the reasons for the continued underrepresentation of Black, Latinx, and Native American scholars in the academy. Decades of research suggests that faculty with marginalized and minoritized identities are engaging in important work related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, both on and off campus. And unfortunately, so much of this labor often goes unrecognized. We ask our colleagues to lead efforts to recruit a more diverse student body. We ask them to serve on task forces and committees, or to informally address DEI issues that may arise. And while it isn't the case for all, women and men of color often express more interest and report more engagement in research and community-based scholarship with the goal of practical impact and problem solving in their respective communities. I think we can all agree that this work is important and it's meaningful, but it's often unrecognized as real work or as real labor or work that counts, and I use counts in quotation marks, in extant tenure and promotion policy. At best, scholars do this work on top of everything else and hope that everything works out before they burn out. And at worst, their engagement in this labor is seen as insufficient and undeserving of tenure or promotion. And because they had less time for the work that is formally recognized as valuable and valid, they don't progress through our extant processes and systems in the ways that we hope they would. Our colleagues at IUPUI are doing the hard work of developing policy and institutional structures that recognize and reward this work as rigorous, as important, and as critical to fulfilling the mission of their institution, serving education and our broader society. And I'm just so thrilled and so grateful that our colleagues at IUPUI were willing to talk with us today about their work, how they got here, what their policy revisions aim to do, and the work that's still ahead of them as they put this policy into place. So with all of this in mind, I'd like to introduce our panelists who will be introducing us to the work that they've been doing to promote equity in the tenure and promotion process at their institution. So first, we have Dr. Rachel Applegate. You raise your hand, Rachel. It's nice to see you. Who is Vice Chancellor for Faculty Affairs and Associate Professor of Library and Information Science. She's a former chair of the Faculty Council, and in her current role, she supports and guides the promotion and tenure process at IUPUI. She provides promotion and tenure workshops, advises individual faculty members, and supports schools in revising their standards. And she's also chairs a faculty committee that reviews changes to campus guidelines each year. And it's this committee that designed the new DEI pathway for tenure and promotion at IUPUI. So excited that you could be with us today, Rachel. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kathy Johnson, who is Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Academic Officer at IUPUI. She is also a professor of psychology and PI on IUPUI's advanced grant, which is called Project EPIC, which has probably one of the best acronyms I've heard in a long time, which stands for Evidence-Informed Promotion of Inclusive Climate. She works very closely with the Chancellor, and they decided to undertake this work based on a shared commitment to taking action to support equity and inclusion. She also worked with constituent groups and leaders across academic affairs to put this policy into place, and works very hard to address concerns and resistance in the respective communities that will ultimately be implementing the policy. So thank you so much for joining us today, Kathy. Our third panelist is Dr. Gina Sanchez-Gabo. I hope I got that right, who is Associate Vice Chancellor for Faculty Diversity and Inclusion and an Associate Professor of Anthropology. She's also IUPUI's team lead of the Aspire Alliance IChange network. And in her role, she provides strategic guidance to academic units in their efforts to attract, hire, retain, and advance faculty from diverse groups. She works collaboratively with colleagues to advance inclusive excellence across the campus. So thank you so much for joining us today, Gina. And then finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Thorington Springer, and she's Associate Dean of Student Affairs and a Professor of English. And so in addition to her work with undergraduates, that's at the center of her administrative work, she's served on several committees that address diversity, equity, and inclusion with attention to improving the experiences of not only underrepresented students, but underrepresented faculty on campus. And so we're just thrilled that you had the time and energy to join us today as well, Jennifer. Thank you so much. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Gina, who's going to provide us with an overview of the origins of this innovative and important work and some details about the policy before we move into our Q&A.
Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you for serving as our moderator today. It's such an honor to have you as well. Thank you all for coming today to hear about our process through which we created this pathway to recognize diversity, equity, and inclusion work that is done among faculty. This is important work, obviously. This is work that has been in process, or at least the desire to have this recognized for many, many decades. As Dr. Griffin mentioned, there is a long history of individuals who have engaged in this work and have not gotten the rewards and recognitions for it. So we feel very fortunate to be in this time and space to have created a way in which to do this, and the way in which we are thinking about it at this point is a first step, obviously, in a longer series of steps that will have to happen in order for this to actually come to fruition and to right the wrongs, or to address the inequities that are longstanding in higher education. We are very much a team effort here, and so I will be we will be talking through our process and how it came about, and the details of that. But it is really important to again reiterate that there are other institutions across the country who have tried to engage in this process in different ways. So trying to incorporate diversity statements, for example, in the promotion and tenure process, or trying to require that their faculty engage in inclusive teaching. And so I don't want to, and I want to recognize, and I don't want to not recognize the fact that there are people at those institutions that are possibly on this call as well. So we were inspired by that work as well. And what we decided to do is to create a pathway that would align our recognition systems with our stated values. And I think there are obviously a lot of institutions of higher learning that have these stated values related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging, access. And it's very important for our institutions to actually walk the talk. And so I think that's what our primary motivation was at this time period. And I feel really fortunate to have been part of that process, and because it is and was a process that occurred very quickly in this time span of one academic year. So again, looking forward to talking and sharing more of that experience, but I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague, Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gina. And let me add your thanks to Dr. Griffin and others for inviting us here today. It truly is an honor, and I'm so humbled to be here with my colleagues from IUPUI. I will be the first to say that I was in the background for this work, and so much of the heavy lifting occurred through meetings led either within schools or within various committees on campus. But I will say that the Chancellor and I, for several years, have really been bothered by the fact that we have these very widely stipulated values, and I believe they truly are authentically held values, but there was a disconnect between those values and what we consider to be worthy of recognition, both in the annual review for merit system as well as for promotion and tenure. And of course, thanks to Gina and her hard work, we've got much better ways of tracking data around faculty retention. And I was concerned that we weren't very successful always in retaining the faculty that we worked so hard to recruit. And I am fully convinced that in so many cases, the faculty that we recruit are immediately sought out by our students, by others to perform various functions that haven't been rewarded. So in a nutshell, we really sought to correct that lack of congruence. I would say that last summer, as we were all grappling with the pandemic, the economic contraction, and frankly, the racial reckoning that was connected to both of those things, we were paying very close attention to what was going on around the country. And really the real spark for this particular work, I would say, came through a letter that was published to Science Magazine by, I believe it was Paul Barber, and a number of colleagues. Many signatories were on this letter, probably from many of the institutions represented here today. But the letter was focused on systemic racism in higher education, and it really was a call to action to think about the ways that we reward faculty, to think about the ways that we review faculty, that we review grants written by faculty. And our chancellor had received a preprint of this letter and shared it with me and the rest of the cabinet. And that really, I think, prompted a deep conviction that this was the year that we were going to try to get some of this work done. So it was that, and then followed by a charge to our deans, who I think were very much on board, thanks to some work that we had been doing with them for years. We just all decided to jump in, and with great support from our faculty council and the leaders from it, we undertook the work. And as Gina mentioned, we did very much rush to get it done within 1 year. I think that's important, and that might come out later in conversation. We didn't want this to be a multi-year, study it and then do it. We just wanted to try to do it. So with that, let me turn the mic over to Rachel Applegate, who will talk a little bit about the mechanics of how we got the work done.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So it's very important that the leadership be supportive and not get in the way of the people who will actually craft the wording that make it happen. And at our campus, that would be through our faculty council, which is our faculty governance. We do not have a union, but we have a very strong tradition of shared governance. So the deans do not dictate stuff, but they support materials. And so from my position in faculty affairs and from my longstanding work with faculty governance, we already had a committee that represented almost all of the schools on campus, and members from that committee who got together via Zoom, of course. And that was really actually a benefit because we had a very large group. It was very participatory. And we hashed out a lot of options, because when you're looking at your own institution, you may say, well, we might want to go this way, or we might want to go that way. And so we chose an option that fit within our existing policy language, yet was innovative. So feasible in 1 year, and yet was a real change. Indiana University had always had language that said that people could present what they called a balanced case of benefit to the university. And their pure research case was the standard that you may see most places, which is how long is your CV? But the balanced case really is that place where we could take those values and say, if you are supporting those values, what does that look like, and how can we reward it within it? So we had this ad hoc committee come up with drafts. We floated drafts. We presented it 3 times to our faculty council. We had 2 town halls. We had an open posting. We got feedback. We found out where people had concerns, misapprehensions, misconceptions, fixed it and moved on. And also we signaled that this was one step in a longer process. It was not the be all and end all. It is a way of addressing one of the most acute problems, which is tenure track faculty, in essence, doing 2 jobs for 1 reward. But it is not the end of the road for that. So I was mostly the shepherd of the procedural steps that would get us to an end that was a decision by our community to embrace these new standards. And Jennifer.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. So like my colleagues, I'm very excited about our newly minted DEI promotion and tenure case. And I'm sure that those of us who are strong proponents of it would agree that it's long overdue. So extremely happy that it's in place. Definitely a great first step. And I'm going to be addressing, as a faculty member, the why now and why this is important. There are several critical reasons, but I'll just mention a couple really quickly, and there will certainly be a little bit of overlap as my colleagues and I continue to talk about the process and how we did it and why this is so critical at this moment. So one of the first things is that it's an intentional act being made by our institution that ensures the alignment of its mission and values with its policies and its practices, right? It's definitely a demonstrated commitment that goes beyond just simply talking the talk. So for example, if we're going to say that we're committed to creating a more welcoming and inclusive campus for our, especially for our underrepresented and underserved students, then there are specific areas that we'll need to give attention to, which will be to ensure that we have representational faculty who can connect with and further enhance the experiences of the students we want to attract. And we'll need to give attention to the recruitment and retention then of minoritized faculty of color. And minoritized and underserved, I should say, because the scope of it goes beyond simply our minoritized faculty of color. But a case such as this one can be used to both attract and retain minoritized faculty. And furthermore, when our students see themselves represented culturally, both on the faculty level and also through the curriculum, they're more likely to feel welcomed and succeed. So creating a DEI case such as this one holds us accountable and ensures that we're true, very true to, and uphold our institutional values as well. Secondly, as Rachel shared a few minutes ago, it's equally important for us to reward the DEI work that's done by faculty. We tend to reward it with a nod or a pat on the back, a certificate, maybe a trophy, right? Or to say this counts as acceptable service. But we do know that with this case, what it can do is to ensure that true value, the right rewards and recognitions are justly instituted. And so again, it's an intentional act that supports our commitment to inclusion and our efforts toward equity when we take a look at faculty and how we are promoted. Thirdly, we have rightly realized that institutional changes will not truly occur when we try to implement new initiatives alone. Rather, we also have to take a look closely at existing policies and think about ways in which we need to amend them. So this again is a first step that we've taken, right, where we have this new P&T option, but there'll definitely be an opportunity for us to look at existing policies within our respective units to see how they'll need to shift in order for us to have this case truly accepted as viable, right? We do know that these policies are not only formal, but informal as well. Take, for instance, departmental cultures and how we communicate what is valued. Some departments, for example, may only recognize publications, whereby making it difficult for those who disseminate their scholarship differently to be successful. So we need to implement new policies, but also amend those that exist, such as the culture that department cultures that I just mentioned. And finally, I think I would be remiss if I didn't co-sign on what Kathy shared in terms of the why now and why we really try to put this into motion. I think that while we have been discussing these issues over time, the most recent national attention to DEI and the social justice issues surely helped us to build momentum and urged us to move forward with an action rather than continuing our conversations about becoming aware about challenges. Rather, again, the action was taken. And I'll stop there.
Great. Has everybody had an opportunity to weigh in before we dive into our questions? All right. Well, thank you all so much for providing that really helpful context. And I'm hopeful that we can have a bit of conversation amongst us with some questions that I know you've been asked often, some questions that I've had since I've read your policy and heard about the work that you were doing. So we're going to start there and then we'll open up to a wider conversation with the community that's joined with us today. But first, I want to start with something that a few of you mentioned. So Jennifer, you just mentioned this, and Kathy, you mentioned it as well, but catalysts, right? Like, so this was a moment that needed to be seized, whether it was what was happening more broadly with the racial reckoning in the United States, or this letter in Science, you know, calling to the Academy to engage with and address systemic racism when it came to faculty. So we think about critical moments, but sometimes don't focus as much on the work that needs to be done before the critical moment to make sure that we're ready to seize it. You know, in some of our conversations with each other, we've talked about ground softening, right? So tell us a bit more about some of the momentum building moments that led to the development of this policy. So how did your institution and its leaders prepare themselves and prepare your environment for this work? And I'm going to ask Gina and Kathy to kind of lead us in this conversation as we get started.
So I'll start. I think the preparation for this moment really began 4 or 5 years ago as the campus launched what was called a Welcoming Campus initiative, in which the Chancellor designated dollars funding for faculty, staff, and/or student groups to propose projects to make our campus more welcoming. And there were 2 rounds of that. So that was launched in the spring of 2016. And there were 2 rounds of this Welcoming Campus initiative funding. And so the campus at the time was collectively thinking about what needs to be done in order to prepare our students to live and work in a more diverse society and world, and how can we better ourselves and the campus in preparation for that. In addition to, or in the second cycle, I would say, of that Welcoming Campus initiative, we had another project that came to fruition that was proposed by Dr. Lori Patton Davis, who is now at Ohio State University, and that's the White Racial Literacy Project. And that was a project that was funded through the Welcoming Campus initiative, but also through Lumina Foundation. And that was in 2018. And through that, we had the opportunity as a campus community to be in dialogue in caucus-like groups, to talk about whiteness, to disrupt it, to see how, you know, what is our politics of privilege, oppression, and so forth in these groups. And so, and the opportunity to invite national leaders to our campus to facilitate those conversations. So I think that, you know, at least over those 2 years, we got campus community talking about why this is important, why diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are an imperative in higher education, and what does that have to do with one's own positionality. Kathy, you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, thanks, Gina. So I couldn't agree more. I think we've also made it very clear to our deans, and with new deans, we make this clear as we're selecting them and onboarding them, that this is a really important area for them to be leaders in. And we've actually taken parts of our Council of Deans meeting and devoted it to, during 2018, it was the White Racial Literacy Project. I want to give kudos to the Aspire Alliance, because in 2019, we turned to an Inclusive Academy by Abby Stewart and Virginia Bellin, and that was our year-long read with our Council of Deans. And of course, during this past year, we were reading Dr. Kendi's work on how to be anti-racist, and that was really, really empowering to the deans, because I think that the one thesis of that book is stop worrying about convincing people and just do it. Do the policy changes that need to be done. The other area that I would mention that actually happened even earlier than the White Racial Literacy Project is that we had a very wonderful faculty learning community that was focused on public scholarship, and in particular on ways of appropriately rewarding and recognizing public scholarship. And much of that work is more locally focused. It often has a social equity lens. And I think that that work had already begun to then appear in school criteria and standards for promotion and tenure. And it was recent enough that people remembered that. So I honestly think that that was another, well, it's not a perfect alignment. It was another important element of work that was taking place that I think helped us be primed and ready to jump in here at this time. But bottom line is I can't say enough about making sure that this is part of dean's work, and that you create community for them to, in some cases, learn the vocabulary and be able to speak with conviction and courage about what needs to be done. And we found that many of them also shared the work with their chairs, which of course is important as well.
Rachel, Jennifer, anything that you want to add to that conversation? It's just really interesting to think about how this change in many ways, probably didn't feel like it came from out of nowhere to folks, because it was part of this larger progression and this work that y'all have been doing for a long period of time.
Yeah, pragmatically, we had created a new rank for teaching professor. Okay, so that's for non-tenure track. It's part of an effort to reward our non-tenure track. And the mechanics of doing that made a great template for the mechanics of doing this. So we weren't building the structure while we were trying to use it to create more change.
That's helpful. So you already had a framework for how to go about doing this kind of work. Yeah, that's great.
Sorry, I just want to add that to echo what Jennifer has said about this particular moment in time and how that propelled us to go forward. So there's no denying that summer of 2020 was a watershed moment. And so I want to just recognize that again and know that during that time period, a lot of campuses had enacted different committees and so forth. And so we also created an action committee in which this work would have, I think, eventually been taken up by this committee, and that committee created a listing of initiatives across campus of how we can engage in anti-racist work. And so I think questioning and evaluating our existing policies with an anti-racist lens was also, that was also happening at the same time, led by our Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Dr. Karen Days. So putting that out there too.
Great, thank you so much for that. So I appreciate the framework for understanding like how we get everybody moving in the same direction to this kind of work. And invariably, as we travel down these paths, there are people who are not interested in joining us on this journey. So tell us a little bit about resistance has looked like as you've developed and introduced this case for tenure and promotion, like a DEI case for tenure and promotion. How have you navigated this resistance? What other things or strategies or solutions have folks suggested, or maybe they just said, we shouldn't be thinking about this at all. So introduce us to a little bit about what resistance has looked like on your campus.
Okay, I am prepared to talk about a few of the resistance points, and others can certainly come in. I think it's very important to the preparatory work. Because at one of our town halls, one of the naysayers said, "You're not saying our P&T system is racist, are you?" And there was this giant silence because we were prepared that the editorial, the letter to the editor of Science magazine is a lovely, concise summary demonstrating the science behind that our systems are racist. So, just let's move on from that particular thing. Some people would say, with well-meaning, they would say, well, we already value this. Everybody is supposed to be a holistically excellent person. But does that really happen when they sit down with a candidate's case and they start saying, well, we would expect to see 20 articles, we only see 10. And by the way, all of those hours of mentoring are represented nowhere. So making them aware of what in reality is being emphasized. Some of them feared that the DEI work was not actually academic work. I don't know what they were thinking, but it's possible of a backlash against the George Floyd protests. They thought that we were only recognizing agitators, that this was a reward for agitators. Now, social justice can be part of an academic portfolio the way lots of things can be, but it was a red herring, so to speak. And Gina chaired a committee of our Campus Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee that came up with examples to help people wrap their brains around it. I mean, what does this work look like? If you haven't been doing it and you haven't noticed other people doing it, what is it? And so that was really very important. There was a little bit about, doesn't this lower standards? But I did point out to them, by the way, we have teaching excellence cases, and those are people who are not going to be your superstar researchers, because we feel that a faculty that has a lot of different skills and experience and expertise, that diversity makes a better environment for our students and ourselves as colleagues. We are a team then who can achieve much more than if we only pick out the one person who can get that giant grant. That is far too narrow a perspective on it. Nobody came out and said, I mean, they said our P&T standards are not racist, which is silly. But they didn't say that DI is not important. And they didn't really have grounds to say that, because as we started out, that was a stated value of our campus. So if you didn't like that, you should have objected to it earlier. And so once you have that groundwork, it becomes easier to say, yeah, is it real? Have we made it real?
That's really helpful. Like continue to come back to like, what's our mission as an institution? What are our values? What do we say we're about? Kind of helps address some of that resistance and also anticipating some of the questions you're going to be asked. Gina, Kathy, Jennifer, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Sure. Kathy, were you going to go?
Oh, please.
Oh, okay. All right. I have a mouthful, I guess, that I could say about one of the things that Rachel mentioned, which is a really sore spot for me, which would be that whole idea of you're going to be lowering the bar somehow. It's really disappointing when that comes up. First of all, it always strikes me as it's a type of a gatekeeper statement, and one that says, here's how I did things and what I'm familiar with and what I'm comfortable with. Please don't make me have to open, to be open or to learn about something new, about a different pathway, right, on how we can promote our colleagues. I don't know how to evaluate this work. I don't know who can evaluate this work. How are we going to find people to review these cases, right? But we're not lowering the bar. In fact, what we're doing is improving who we are as an institution, right? This inclusive process helps us to get to where we should be. But does the approval of this case reduce the question for viable candidates of if they would like to go up on it? Of course not. I think that we're going to have colleagues that even now that this case is a possibility, who are not going to be sure about whether they want to do it or not. And it's going to be our job to encourage them to use it. And, I can stop here and maybe later share some possible steps that I think we ought to take, because again, we're very much at the beginning and we're trying to figure it out in terms of how it's going to roll out in our different units. But, I really think it's important for us to recognize that, again, we're not lowering any standards. If anything, we're raising them, and we are giving attention to equity in a way and inclusivity in a way that we have not before by implementing this case.
Thank you so much for that, Jennifer. Kathy.
Sure.
We're just going to add two other bits of recollection around pockets of interference. One that I remember is that there were some faculty who thought we should just deal with this without bothering to touch P&T, that we should just consider this overload. Maybe we reduce people's teaching load to accommodate the additional work that is widely recognized as happening. We dismiss that because promotion and tenure really is at the heart of the academy. And if we really want to change systems and structures, that's the first thing that we should do. I think making it sound like service, I think further demeans the importance of the work. And then the second thing that I wanted to mention, and this came up a lot in my own school, I'm in the School of Science, there was a panic that everyone was going to be assessed in this area, and that if you weren't doing the work, that was going to be, a strike against you. And what I try to say over and over and over is that there is an expectation that we all are engaging in professional growth and development, particularly in the area of teaching, because that is something that all of us do. We want to make sure that we are teaching as effectively and creating welcoming and inclusive classrooms to the best of our ability. But the fact that I think people made that connection just kind of shows that there's this immediate sort of defensiveness. You're not going to make me do my work any differently. And I think it was important to have people in all of our roles, and especially faculty champions like Jennifer and Rachel, indicating that it is really important for us all to do the work. I've noticed a couple of questions sort of bouncing around this. So let me just make sure to be clear that the focus of this work was on creating a new promotion and tenure faculty or pathway that recognized excellence related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. At the same time, we were certainly championing, and we know that many schools have adopted the practice or plan to soon adopt the practice of also looking at DEI statements as part of promotion and tenure. But the work that we've been focused on is really at the campus level. At IUPUI, there's typically a department level of review, then a school level of review, and then all cases come to the campus. So we started at that campus level of review because that then gives schools and departments something to align with. And that's part of the, many steps that still need to be taken story that has been alluded to.
Yeah, absolutely. To that point, Kathy, I'm thinking about, policy change even at my own institution, that, you're trying to do something bold and leaders are trying to move, the campus or their colleges in a certain direction. So we institute these policy changes at higher levels of the institution. So at the institutional level, at the college level, but we know from, personal experience, from scholarship, that so much of the action and the thinking and the important decision making takes place at the department level when we're talking about tenure and promotion policy. So how are you thinking about institutional policy and its capacity to shift policies and cultures of departments and more localized environments? And what strategies are you contemplating to foster more local organizational change?
So I can take a crack at that and then others can chime in behind me. So I really don't think that we could have worked as efficiently in the opposite direction. We couldn't have waited for departments and schools to take the first step and then we align with them. What we've made very clear to schools is that, that work happened last year at the campus level. We did have a few schools very quickly work to endorse those same criteria and standards at the school level, but most of them did not have the time to do that. So that's the first order of business for the upcoming academic year, is to review both the school level and the departmental level criteria and standards, and to determine within that discipline what this might look like. Now, some of them might say we're going to opt out and not do that. And that will probably have to be okay for at least a while until there's more, sort of social norming pressure that takes place across colleges and schools. But that is the important next step, as well as the reflection on how we're making decisions of merit. I honestly worry that by focusing only on promotion and tenure, most of us go up for promotion twice in our careers, maybe 3 times if we're the superstar. But for most of us, it's a very irregular sort of thing. Whereas building this thinking into our annual review procedures for merit, I think is a much faster way of systematizing the change. And also, especially around teaching, making sure that we are taking steps to formulate plans individually about how we're going to make our teaching practice more inclusive.
Great. Other folks want to weigh in?
Can I jump in? And then Jennifer, sorry. In the talks that I've been doing, I'm almost flattering them. I am saying, look, you are the people who know what this means within your discipline and your department. We need you to find the ways to make this real within your discipline. Different disciplines start from different starting points. Their whole field may be very far behind, in which case they need to recognize what a heavy lift it is to move the needle at all in that area. Others are much farther ahead. I mean, our School of Social Work was the first people to adopt this. But I think that it helped them become more comfortable with the campus standards by emphasizing that the school would have its say, that we weren't negating their voice, their expertise, their disciplinary things within the context of this is an important thing, and kind of we expect you to do it. So that was my main point there. Sorry, Jennifer.
Oh, no, you're fine. You're fine. I can just build on that and look more specifically from, again, the standpoint of a faculty member who mentors others who are coming up for promotion, and thinking about how we really encourage people to do this and what we can promise, steps that we can take that are specific to our departments if they do agree that this is a viable case. I think one of the things we can do is overly communicate at all levels that this is indeed a viable case once a unit has made the decision to make it an option. Over communicate it until it makes its way into our veins, if you will, and we are really preaching and believing it. Changing a culture will certainly take time, but I believe we have to put the right people in place who are willing to give brain power to how we can collectively change our perceptions of traditional publications being the only way to demonstrate or measure impact. Right? We have a unique opportunity to expand how we evaluate the diverse ways in which our colleagues' contributions impact their respective disciplines and how they disseminate their work, right? Publication, again, is not the only route that people can take, and that's not the only way that we can demonstrate impact, right? I can publish something and maybe say, I hope 100 people will take a look at it, right? But then I can have a colleague who does something in the community and disseminate scholarship that way, and it's more impactful than that one publication that I've written. So we need to be open to that. And thirdly, we need to think about infrastructure and how we'll measure impact for the case. Will our way of evaluating our colleagues' work look differently, right, for this particular case? Will the primary committee that reviews the work need to be created specially and more specifically, right, where we're thinking about maybe even inviting external folk to serve on that committee early on? We need to think about how we can rely on our experts who are in-house, right? As we do with the existing cases. For example, we tend to look to our librarians, right? Who can help us to think about measuring impact and looking at the work that we do. We have experts in social media, right? And that's an outlet that's used for scholarship by some of our colleagues, but we have people who can help us to think about, again, how to measure the impact when our colleagues use those platforms. And clearly we're gonna be, building and learning at the same time, no doubt, but the current cases would have gone through, the current cases that we're working on, when they're going through the various stages, I think that we just have to think about what seems to be working well, where the areas where we need to improve, but more importantly, if we have someone who raises their hand to say, yes, I want to try this, we have to put the right support in place for them and take a lot of notes, right, as we're doing it. And again, I just think that what this does is we're going to have to re-educate ourselves and our colleagues about our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how this case brings us a little closer to our goals in that area. So again, it's really the beginning, and there's a lot of work ahead of us, but I really think that it's so worth it. So those are just some of the things that are ruminating in my mind as I think about how we begin to change the culture in terms of how we reward our colleagues' contributions when we're reviewing them for promotion.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the thoughts that are bubbling around in my head in response to your comments, Jennifer, that, there are so many things that matter that are really hard to count, or at least we're not as comfortable with counting, and that we've made the things that we can count, the ones that count the most in terms of defining who's excellent. And I see a comment here in the chat from Kim Ramsey White. We have to redefine what a superstar researcher is, that creating structures that identify another path that's rigorous, that's thoughtful, that says, you can be excellent in this way and be tenured and promoted in this way is one way of starting to redefine what it means to be excellent as a faculty member. So I just think it's hard work, it's iterative work, and I'm just so grateful to all of you for starting our field down the path of trying to do this work. Those are the questions that I have for you. That's not true. I actually have a whole bunch of other questions for you that I hope I could ask you another time, but we certainly want this to be a broad dialogue with our community that's joined us today. So I'm going to invite Jessica Bennett back into the conversation to start taking some of the questions from our colleagues that have joined us today.
I'm going to integrate a few questions here because I think, Kathy, we've been trying to touch on them a little bit in progress, but there are a lot of questions about kind of what did you consider, right? What were some of the options you left off the table? Why then the balanced case? What did it seem to do the most for you in terms of options? And then there's a follow-up on there that I think is really important about what are potential consequences for having this work be kind of separated out from a more traditional pathway? And is there a chance that that work could be considered less valuable? So I asked you 3 questions all at once. I'm going to restate them. What did you leave off as an option? What did you discard or kind of decide that doesn't work for us here right now, right in this time? And let's start there, and then I'll turn to the other 2.
This
Rachel.
is Rachel, and I'll just briefly reiterate because Gina and Jennifer were also in these conversations. But one option that people wondered is we have teaching, research, and service. Should we have teaching, research, service, and diversity? Okay, a 4th bucket. Okay, and there's some pros to that. There's some structural pros, but we decided that pretty much every example we came up with could already fit into the 3. So there's some concern in the questions about separating this out and therefore making it vulnerable to being marginalized. I mean, literally marginalized. So I don't critique any university that decides to go that route. It's just within our context, I thought that that was the best, or we thought that that was the best. We definitely debated that one. The annual review thing, I have a very pragmatic hat. And remember, Kathy Johnson said that people were scared. This case is an option. No one is forced into it. And so therefore, some people who might have really opposed it were okay with it being an option for other people. When the rubber hits the road these coming years, when we say, are you part of IUPUI's mission of being a welcoming campus and how are you doing that? That's an important conversation, but we didn't get tangled up in that too much for this particular one. So that is as much a strategic decision as it is a conceptual decision. So I'll stop there and let others talk.
I just want to add that, again, in those conversations in the ad hoc committee, there were questions about doing away with the entire structure that we have and just having a singular bucket with which to holistically evaluate people. And in fact, there are institutions that do just that. And so we're very unique as an institution of having had a system where we rigidly ask people to designate their areas of excellence and then also equate other types of work in those other areas outside of that one area of excellence. And we also had, again, this balanced case, which is a demonstration that the traditional balance case is a demonstration of highly satisfactory across those domains of research, service, and teaching. But I want to reiterate what Rachel has said, which is that early on, which is that a lot of people hear about this case, they're not quite sure what to make of it, a DEI integrated case. And we have been very steadfast in saying this is faculty work. So it's not like, I'm sure that there's a myriad of different types of work that faculty engage in that perhaps would be new to some people, but in essence, this is faculty work. So it's not going to look outrageous or unrecognizable in terms of the work that a person going up on this case would put together for evaluation.
Thank you for that. I wanted to just dive a little bit deeper into the this kind of sub question of, is there a concern either among you, among your faculty, that maybe individuals who choose this pathway will have an experience of feeling less valued or less respected than maybe the kind of other, your other version of a case, or even just a more neutral, balanced case approach? So just kind of curious if you all have any thoughts on that.
I would like to give the blunt example, and then I'll have my colleagues give the nice example. As an institution that prides itself on research, I think any case that is not research can and has been looked at in this way. So I will just say that. And in fact, we've had a lesser number of individuals go up on the balance case. So I anticipate that will happen as well, that we won't have cases that surpass the main case, which is research. But I do want to lift up just for a half a second the work that we engage in as part of the Spire Alliance and the IChange network, as well as our Project EPIC, as areas that are trying to affect this type of change in culture and climate in the STEM departments, of which we are not anticipate that we will get many cases coming forth from those particular areas at this moment. So there's still work to be done there. Thank you.
I am excited at the possibility of somebody finally seeing a pathway where they only have to do one job, where they don't have to do two jobs, because we have people who are doing diversity work, making an effort, and then when they're only judged on the traditional research metrics, in contrast to their non-marginalized counterparts, that's a great recipe for burning people out. And so if we want a sustainable model, and we like the work that they do, which we actually do, and it makes a difference, then we need to work that into our reward system.
Absolutely. I can certainly testify, right? As a faculty member who's been consistently involved in DEI work across all three areas, you know, of faculty life, I can say it was truly exhausting and very gratifying for the most part, but definitely not justly rewarded. And so this is definitely a case that will allow us to get credit for the work that we're doing. But as Rachel just said so well, it prevents us from burnout. It prevents us from doing double the work, because I can tell you, when I put my case together for promotion to full, there was so much frustration there because I had all of this work that I'd done that could not fit into any of the bins for any of the cases, including the one that I ultimately chose, which was the balance case. Because here's the deal with the balance case. You can disseminate in your scholarly work in different ways, but there's still the expectation that you've published in all three areas. Now, is that a formal expectation? I don't believe so. However, informally within our departments, that is the expectation. And so people who are reviewing, when they don't see that, it's a red flag. So for me, what this case does is it takes away that extra burden of, you know, doing two jobs, when in fact, there's one that you're more passionate about, and the work that you're doing is definitely contributing as equally as the work done by your other colleagues who are working towards the other cases and using those other pathways. So again, it's definitely a lot of work, but just let's remember that the cases that we have in place right now, they didn't just evolve out of nowhere and were, you know, ready to go. It took work, it took time. We had to go back, reflect, revise. We're always amending. Rachel leads the committee that takes a look at these things from time to time to improve them. So, you know, it's definitely worth the effort. And again, what it does is it helps us to retain our faculty members who usually are called upon to do all of this work, yet and still they're not justly rewarded for it. Instead, they're expected to force it into pre-existing bins. So I really appreciate how this can work for those who are passionate about the work.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo and give a shout out. Everything that Jennifer said is so on point and important. I also think it speaks to the importance of that focus on leadership and an equity-minded leadership. We need deans and vice chancellors. We need everyone to kind of shut that argument down, because the work is excellent. It is important for our campus, and we are just committed to making sure that it's appropriately recognized. I would say that the scary piece for me right now, and where I see potentially great utility to the Aspire Alliance, is in the external review process. So it's all well and good to create new pathways and change our standards, but we're still going to have to rely on external reviewers from the academy writ large to weigh in on these cases. And while we've, of course, provided templates of letters that explain all of this, we're worried that people are not going to be able to evaluate it well from the outside. And frankly, from the inside, we've got to spend time on the professional development needed for people to be able to do this work. But I think that that's a very rich area, potentially for funding, potentially for working with each other to develop a cadre of external reviewers cross-representing all of our disciplines, maybe starting in STEM, who can evaluate these statements. I know the University of California has done some really great work on that evaluation piece. It would be terrific to kind of knit that together with thinking around promotion and tenure, so that we really are not kind of sending these cases out where they become more vulnerable through those letters.
Well, thank you for that, Kathy. I think that addressed actually one of the questions in here is, what are we doing? What are you all doing about the external reviewers? Because we know they often are applying the standards of their own institution, whether we want them to or not, when we ask them to review for our institutions, right? There are several questions I think about, wanting to clarify and then further understand kind of the implementation process, right? So you set the foundation for the policy by having a campus-wide, university-wide set of expectations, a policy, right? And now we're kind of you're handing it off to the units, right, to start to do something. So there are a lot of questions here about what happens if a unit doesn't sign on this year to participate in developing a policy? What happens if a faculty member in that unit sees that this is an option and wants to use this option, but their unit hasn't developed the specificity? So I think that kind of covers most of the tenor of the questions I'm seeing in that area. So does anyone want to speak to kind of that next step and kind of, is there accountability? Is there a requirement, or is it an opt-in? So tell us a little bit more about that. And that's for anyone. Anyone can jump in.
I think that's why we started with the deans, is because when you think about the strategic direction for your unit, and every unit right now is working on a diversity strategic plan, can you do that without having some recognition of DEI work within your school? I mean, and then Kathy really is the one who holds deans accountable, has those dialogues with them about what are you trying to do and how are you going to accomplish it?
Right, so that important question of how is this aligning with what your other plans are, Kathy? Yeah.
It's a delicate kind of choreographed dance, because I am the first. I used to be a faculty president in my school. I'm the first to acknowledge that the criteria that we use to evaluate faculty are under the umbrella of shared governance. So it really, no matter how much I want to do this, yesterday, there are processes that we need to work through. I do think that the role that faculty council plays, and I work very closely with our executive committee for that faculty council. I think keeping them very informed, very much in the loop, I would say almost to a person, they have been solidly advocates for this work. I just do think that there is a need to kind of work through those processes. I think that we can plant seeds. As Rachel said, I do, with the chancellor, meet annually with each dean about their leadership goals, and we ask questions about, what are you doing in this space? And everyone has their own diversity plans at the school level, and many of them are pushed down to the department level as well. So I think it's choreographing those multiple layers within the institution and constantly shining a light on successes. I'm excited. I do think we're going to have our first few cases through this next cycle, and it will be so great to be able to throw those cases on a website in some form and just lift them up and help people to better understand, because it's so hard to take these first steps, because once you take them, you realize that there's 10 other, probably 1,000 other steps that you need to take. But I think, this group of colleagues that's even on the webinar today, I mean, it's just so energizing to have such terrific solidarity with my colleagues from across campus, and just try to do the work as best as we can.
Yeah, I know one thing along the veins of what you're talking about, Kathy, putting things in motion in our school right now. We've started looking at the policies and making some changes for this case. And our associate dean for faculty, we've discussed using my case, which was one for a balance case, but could easily be used for this. We've talked about sitting together with a couple other people and transforming my case to fit this so that we can use it as a model as well. It's not going to be perfect, but definitely a beginning, and allowing other people to weigh in, of course.
Thank you so much. I think, I think what's so exciting about actually our conversation today is that you're really in situ, right? It's not a done deal. You're really being able to model the complexity of this process of how do you build consensus using your shared governance processes, right? There can't just be a magic wand from the top down, while also thinking about, right, the shared governance structures all throughout your institution as potentially, if they engage with this, avenues for culture change, right? So I'm just wondering how you're seeing kind of maybe some potentials in this work. So this is my own question, sorry, I'm just my prerogative. Your own potentials for this work and maybe other aligned work kind of for advancing a deeper culture change at IUPUI.
From my perspective, two of the most interesting parts are the one that Kathy mentioned before, which is the external reviewers and getting a academic cultural change that recognizes work that's not simply how long is your CV, so that we can do that. From one of my other hats where I work on evaluation within my own discipline, how do we articulate the value of that community impact? It's not an H index, and somebody had mentioned student evaluations. We know that those are crap mostly, but how do we, I think there's a lot of work, and fortunately we have a lot of people on our campus who would like to do that, and some people who are connected outside our campus. But getting that consensus across the country among academics that this work can be articulated, can be seen, can be made visible, and can be valued. I mean, it can't just be us, it has to be other people too.
I think that also just building on the momentum is useful, and building on the connections we have, as we mentioned earlier, through the advanced community and through Aspire Alliance. So building on the momentum in order to continue to over communicate, as Jennifer said, the value of that particular pathway and what that means. And this goes back to the original comment of, how do you redefine what a superstar is? And I think what's really great about this particular moment or this initiative is that it has raised questions about systems and the other systems that need change. So I think this whole idea of building on the momentum that we have to open up doors for more of those conversations that say what is excellence, what is scholarship in the academy, how is it, what types of revisions need to happen to modernize the academy, if you will. And so I think that building upon that is important. Someone else had in the chat, the conversations about community engaged scholarship, and I think again that is another case that's very much parallel to the DEI integrative case. And so I think that we will be, turning our attention to that, given the fact that we already had that momentum, as we talked to, as Kathy mentioned earlier, about adding language into our guidelines. So it is a way to, again, recognize what other pathways are there out there that could be recognizing and rewarding faculty work so that they are they can advance and they are more satisfied in our academy. So.
Thank you so much. And there are so many more questions we didn't get a chance to. Luckily, the panelists agreed before they even saw what the questions were that they would do their best to provide some answers to any questions we weren't able to get to in the live. So we'll put those together and kind of put them together as a package for all registrants and attendees. So if we didn't get to your question, we are sorry. We will get to it soon. I saw Kathy went unmuted right as I went into that, so I didn't know if she wanted to have a second to last word, and then we'll let Dr. Griffin have the last word.
I thank you, Jess. I was just going to say real quickly, some of you might not know IUPUI as an institution, and I just wanted to say if we can do this, anyone can do this, because we're probably one of the most complicated institutions of higher education in the country. We're very large, very focused on research, but we're a core campus of Indiana University that confers degrees through both Purdue and IU. So we have, believe it or not, my tenure is through IU, but my promotion is approved by Purdue. So there's lots of constraints on doing things. But at the same time, I love to say that I think all of that creates environmental press to be innovative, to be creative and nimble. But certainly folks on campuses with fewer constraints could probably go much further and faster than we've been able to. So thanks.
All right, well, I don't even have words for the gratitude that I have for all of you and for your willingness to share all of this good thinking and this good work that's gone into these policy revisions that y'all are working through. It's hard work, but it's just so rewarding. And we talk about doing this a lot. So it's been such a gift to have the opportunity to have a conversation with a group of folks who actually are doing the work. I wanted to close today by coming back to something I started with, that everybody's asking, what should we be doing about the problem, right? Like, we know that these disparities exist. We know that you know, a lot of our marginalized and minoritized colleagues are carrying a different workload than their colleagues, and we want to reward it and we want to recognize it. And how do we do that? Anybody who knows me and has worked with me before knows that I have a very complicated relationship with best practices. But what I have heard in what y'all have shared has been best thinking. So I just wanted to share a couple of my core takeaways in terms of the thinking that y'all have done that I hope that other folks will consider as they think about what policy revisions could look like on their own campuses. First, I heard almost all of you talk about the importance of leaders being brave and stepping forward and doing what they think is important and that what they think is right, even though they know there'll be resistance and there'll be challenges and it won't be easy, just to lead and to be brave. And that bravery is a core part of leadership. Secondly, I heard a lot of like seizing the moment, that we're at a critical moment right now. We're at a critical time point where folks are talking about these issues, and to really step into that moment and use it as an opportunity to use this moment as a catalyst for getting things done. But I also heard that it's never the wrong time to get started, that this transformational work takes a long period of time, and that if we want to build inclusive communities, that's a long, ongoing, enduring effort. And that while, you know, we may seize a particular moment for policy change, contextual change, environmental change always needs to be taking place. And it's something that we need to keep at the front of mind. Be intentional about how we align policy change with mission, that it's helpful in terms of advancing these efforts. And that resistance isn't necessarily something to be afraid of. It can be navigated through engagement, that we should lean into the resistance rather than trying to push it away, that it makes our policy better, it makes our thinking better if we bring more people around the table and actually make resistors part of the process. So I just want to close with my gratitude, with a big thank you to IUPUI, to Aspire, to IChange, to everybody who put this together. Thank you for the push to widen our bar, to name and recognize excellence in new and innovative ways, and to shift policy, even when it's hard, and able to address equity in the academy. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be in conversation with all of you today.
Thank you.
It was fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.